I'd like to introduce myself to those of you that I haven't met yet. My name is Carrie Hall, and I'm the Executive Managing Director of Commercial and Regional Banking for Texas Capital Bank. Welcome to Beyond Banking, Successful Leadership Transitions. We thank you for joining us today, and I believe you're going to get a lot of useful information out of our speaker. So today we are actually going to have a true passing of the baton, although I don't actually have a baton. So I want to introduce to you, this is Chris Calvert. Congratulations.
Thank you, Carrie. Thank you. So thank you, and thank you, Carrie. One thing Carrie failed to mention is that my promotion was possible due to her own. Carrie is now Texas Capital Bank's Executive Managing Director of Commercial and Regional Banking, a well-deserved promotion that all of us in Austin are so proud to see. Congratulations. And don't worry, Carrie won't be far. She's still officing here in Austin, and though she's now serving Texas Capital Bank clients and employees in our 5 major Texas markets. I'd also like to introduce some other Texas Capital Bank leaders who are here today. First, Curtis Burchard, Executive Vice President, Manager in Commercial Real Estate. Hey, Curtis. And Ben Carter, Executive Vice President, Wealth Strategist, and Head of Statewide Planning and Trust. I'd like to start us off with a quick show of hands. Would you please raise your hand if you've read Stephen Covey's book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People? Wow, that's a number of you. Now, can any of you who raised your hand tell me what the second habit in Covey's book is? Anyone? All right, the second habit is begin with the end in mind. This habit is based on imagination, the ability to envision in your mind what you cannot at present see with your eyes. Now, if you haven't read Covey's book, as an entrepreneur, a business owner, or a business leader, you are probably experienced with this kind of imaginative thinking. It's what creates the ideas for new businesses, inspires the visions that colleagues work toward, and dominates the competition. On particularly rough days, every one of you have probably daydreamed about your exit from the business. But many of you might not have given your exit much serious thought at all. After all, it's a topic to think about. Retirement may seem far off, and there are more pressing issues that demand your attention, or you can't even imagine leaving the business you built. But without the proper time, planning, and preparation, you might not be able to achieve the best outcome for you, your family, and for the business. So regardless of where you are in the succession planning process, I think you'll benefit from hearing from our keynote speaker today. At only 28 years of age, Richard J. Bryan took the reins of a 100-year-old, $120 million family-owned car and truck dealership in the UK after his father was forced to retire due to illness. That alone was a challenge. Worse, the business was losing $3.5 million a year, and there was no leadership succession plan in place. After navigating a successful turnaround, and 10 years after he stepped into the CEO role, Richard sold the business and began embarking upon a new career as an executive coach and owner of a highly successful real estate business. Today, Richard is going to share with us some of the stories and lessons learned from his journey and provide you with actionable steps to get started on your progress for your own succession plans. Please help me welcome Richard Bryan.
Well, thank you, Chris. Great to be here today. Thank you to Texas Capital Bank for bringing me in to speak at Beyond Banking this year. And it's actually really nice to be in Austin. It's the first time my wife and I have been here, though we've been meaning to come for a number of years because my son is actually called Austin. He's 21 years old, so we've been planning on coming here for a few years now. It's nice that we finally made it. I think he actually thinks Austin was named after him, but that's another story. So I'd like to start today by asking you a question. It's a little bit off the wall, but just bear with me. How many of you remember your first love? Well, I remember mine as if it was yesterday. She was beautiful. She lit up whenever I was around and made me feel like $1,000,000. Now, she had a few more miles on her than I would have liked, but hey, they say love is blind, right? Her name was Lola. Let me tell you about her. Lola was a 1.6-litre fuel-injected Ford Orion. Gunmetal grey with just a fleck of silver in the paint that caught the sunlight just right. Absolutely gorgeous. And I remember one day Lola and I were taking a drive, and as we meandered along the English country road, she handled like a dream. But as we approached my hometown of Bristol, she started to hesitate, and Lola was never one to hesitate. I pulled over to the side of the road just as her engine failed. Now, I had no idea what was wrong, but I did know I was going to have to call the local Ford dealership, which just happened to be owned by my family. And as I set off to find a payphone, yes, it was before we all had mobile phones in our pockets, I thought, I know, I'll phone my father's assistant, Jean. She'll know what to do. Hello, could I speak to Jean Guest, please? It's Richard Bryan. Yes, Bryan. That's right, same as the name over the door. Okay, thanks. Jean, it's Richard, his dad there. No, don't interrupt him, I've broken down. No idea what's wrong. I'm on Cumberland Road. Yep, by the cathedral, that's right. Oh, that'd be brilliant if you can send a couple of guys. Oh, and Jean, please don't tell Dad. Okay, thanks, bye. As I sat there waiting for the tow truck to turn up, all I could think was, now they're really going to think I'm the idiot's son. Son of the owner of the largest Ford dealership in the city, and I can't even start my own car. At that point, the tow truck turned up with 2 guys on board. Nigel, our most experienced mechanic, and his young apprentice, Charlie. Oh, Nigel, thanks so much for coming. I don't know what's wrong. I've tried turning her over, completely dead. I think it might be something to do with the fuel injection system. No worries, mate. Give me the keys. Let's have a look. Nigel jumped into the driver's seat and started carrying out some tests. Less than 2 minutes later, he jumped back out. Well, mate, it's definitely a fuel problem. You ain't got any. At this point, Charlie jumped out the truck, laughing hysterically, grabbed a small empty gas can and said, "Oh, all right, Governor, do you want me to do the honours and fill her up?" And I watched as he walked 20 feet to the gas station I was parked next to. Just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, Nigel yelled, "Charlie, show some respect to Mr. Bryan. This Einstein here is going to be our boss in a few years." And 10 years later, when I was his boss, every time I walked through the workshop and made eye contact with Nigel, he'd just look at me and go, as if the whole thing was our little secret. But you see, I knew full well that he told everyone on the shop floor, and probably any bloke in the pub who cared to listen. In fact, I can picture him now in the Rose and Crown on a Friday night. "All right, boys, time for our toast. We raise our beers, and we give 3 cheers, and we do it all in fun. To Mr. Richard Bryan, his lordship, our boss, the idiot son." Well, at least that's how I imagined it when. Now, in fairness, Lola did have a faulty fuel gauge, so it was showing that she had a quarter of a tank when in fact she was empty. But somehow I don't think Nigel shared that bit of information when he told the story again and again and again. And such is the joy of growing up as the 4th generation in a family business. So for the short time we're together today, I'd like to share with you some of the lessons I've learned, not just from being in a leadership position in a family business for the last 20 years, but also through working with some of my clients who are privately held companies across the United States and United Kingdom. And I love that quote, actually, that Chris shared at the start, or one of the principles from the 7 habits, because I think it's absolutely spot on when it comes to succession planning in terms of begin with the end in mind. But more about that in a minute. I'd like to actually share a little bit more about my story so that you can understand my comments today in context. So to say that I grew up in the shadow of the family business would be an understatement, because we had 4 generations of the same family living under one roof. And yes, I am the little blonde chap sat in the back seat with the page boy haircut, and I'm sat next to my father, Michael, who's waving, my grandfather, Jim, who's driving the car, and my great-grandfather, James Bryan, who sat in the front also giving us a little wave. And we were a bit like a British version of the Waltons, for those of you that remember that show. But it was a great place to grow up. And it was my great-grandfather, James, who started the family business back in 1913. Originally, he was a taxi driver. He was one of the first cars on the road back then, at the turn of the century. And then he saved up his money and started doing repairs and maintenance on the few vehicles that were on the road back then, until he eventually bought his first garage. And there's a picture of that here next to the Cathedral Hotel. But it was in 1930. Oh, by the way, I actually love this slide because I think this is what rush hour would have looked like in 1915. Probably a bit more relaxed than these days. But it was in 1933 that he got his first big break when he was awarded the Ford franchise for Bristol. So Bryan Brothers were one of the first Ford main dealers in the southwest of England. And it was as a Ford dealership that we grew over the years, with my grandfather and then my father subsequently joining the business. Then I came along and went to high school in my hometown of Bristol. And then I went to university in Edinburgh, Scotland, because I decided I needed to learn a foreign language. Those of you that have been to Scotland will know what I'm talking about. My first year, I shared a flat with 2 guys from Glasgow who spoke a little bit like this. All right, Richie, how you doing? How you doing? Ah, great, magic. You fancy going for a few scoops? Oh, fantastic. Scoops, who knows what scoops are? Anyone guess? Well, that's what I thought. They're beers, actually, pints. Pints. I don't know why they didn't just say pints. It's all very confusing. So it really was learning another language. So after university, I graduated with my sort of major was in business and my minor was in Scottish as a second language. And I got a job with Ford Motor Company as a management trainee. And it was a phenomenal experience. I got to work in great cities such as Washington, D.C., Boston, Massachusetts, and Denver, Colorado. And I'd like to think that my time in Denver was particularly well spent because that's where I met my wife, Melissa. And we've now been married, happily married, for almost 24 years. Well, I'm happy anyway. I think she is. Maybe I should ask her later. So life was good. I was in my mid-20s. I had a challenging but rewarding job. I'd met my wife, and I was loving living in the United States. So I was very happy. And then I got a phone call from my mother that changed everything. My father was going into hospital to have an operation, but not just any operation. He was going to have his leg amputated. Now, if you're diabetic, that's serious, but if you also have a heart condition, it's life-threatening. So my mother said to me, look, I know you're doing well over there in America, but it would mean so much to your dad if he knew you were coming back to join the family business. Well, rule number 1 in the family business is you don't say no to your mum. And so I quit my job, I flew home, and I joined the family business. Now, I'm pleased to say that my father survived the operation, but he never worked full-time again. And so by the time I was 28, I was running the business, and we had $120 million a year in sales, 360 staff at 6 locations, but somehow we were managing to lose more than $3.5 million a year. We had a bank overdraft of $5 million a year. I can see some people in the room looking very twitchy now. And And we had a lot of staff who had an attitude of entitlement because of their length of service rather than being focused on customer satisfaction. So, hey, not the best situation to walk into in my 20s. This is a picture of one of our more modern showrooms about that time. This is our Volvo dealership. So I didn't know much at 28, but I did know that I couldn't turn this business around by myself. I lacked the experience and the credibility with our bank and our manufacturer partners. And so I set out to find someone to help me. And I went through a pretty rigorous search process with a recruitment company out of London. And we came up finally with a short list of 6 people. And I started interviewing them. And I realized pretty early on that they all had 2 things in common: huge salary expectations and even bigger egos. These were retired corporate CEOs looking for a bit of easy consulting, and what they saw was a family business in trouble and a young CEO. And I could tell when I looked into their eyes, they weren't really committed to the outcome. And I was about to give up on this search, and then I met candidate number 5, Frank. Frank was an unusual character, ex-special forces with a fine arts degree. The sort of guy that could paint you a pretty good picture, but if you didn't like it, he had the ability to kill you. So he was a strange mix, but I remember the first time we met him, I shook hands with him. He took a seat, and I started in on my list of prepared questions, and I realized very quickly that I was going to get some benefit from my degree as Scottish as a second language. Frank, you've seen the financials, you know the situation. If you were to get this job, what's the first thing you'd do to stop the losses? Coffee. I quite like coffee. I'll start with a cup of coffee. Coffee? If we do get to work together, you find out I drink an unhealthy amount of coffee. In fact, a few years ago, I got the shakes, so I stopped drinking it. And then I realized I was still shaking. I thought, might as well enjoy myself. I was starting to think this was a waste of time, albeit a more entertaining one. But then an amazing thing happened. About 2 cups of coffee in, the caffeine must have kicked in, and Frank gave me a brilliant step-by-step plan of exactly what he was going to do, not just to stop the losses, but to help me put the business back on the road to success. It was an absolute masterclass. And I realized at that moment that I hadn't actually been interviewing Frank, he'd been interviewing me. At the end of the meeting, we shook hands once more, and he looked at me and he said, "Richard, I know I'm expensive, but I'll promise you one thing. I'll get the job done." And he left me, and I remember standing in the middle of my office with this sort of huge adrenaline rush, because I realized that with Frank by my side, we might just be able to turn this business around. And so for the rest of the time this afternoon, I want to share with you, as I said, some of the things that I have learned about succession planning and next generation leadership. Now that you know my story, I want you to think about yours with the things that I'm saying today. And just to help me, by a show of hands, how many family businesses are in the room? Okay. And privately owned or partnerships? Okay. Thank you. Any public companies in the room? Okay. I think the bank. So, great. Well, let's make a start on this. I think when you're looking at your succession plan, and one thing that's really important, whether you want to pass it on to next generation of your family, maybe consider selling it to a business partner, or if you want to exit. We'll talk about that a bit later. One of the key things is that you have a team of A players around you. And when I inherited my management team, although I was young, I recognized pretty early on that I had a team of 12 people with an average length of service more than 30 years, which was great, apart from the fact that some of them were already retired, but they just happened to be turning up for work and still taking a paycheck. So with Frank's help, we needed to make some changes there, because if we were going to change the fortunes of the business, keep it going to the fourth generation, and eventually, as it happens, we sold the business, sold it at the beginning of 2008, we needed a stronger management team, and so we needed some A players. And I define A players as those people that contribute disproportionately to your business. They're the 20% who deliver 80% of the results or productivity. And so that's exactly what we did. We set out and we built a really strong management team. And I'd like you to meet Frank very quickly and hear what he has to say about that.
What would you say in your experience are the sort of characteristics that you look for in those people that are going to really make a difference?
You need to look for people who have got a positive attitude. You need to have people who don't know that what you're asking them to do is impossible. Will still do it, Richard, as you well know. And I think also you need to have people that are going to be compatible with you as a manager. That's not to say you employ people who are like you, very much the reverse. But you have to have people who are competent for that particular position you want to fill. And you need support in enabling you to choose the right person. Don't take it on yourself. So maybe that's part of the process. But much more, it's a gut instinct. You will know when you're interviewing someone whether or not they are the kind of person that you can work with. Because if you can't work with someone, then you're already leading yourself up to a potential problem.
Okay, so you've met Frank. So you'll see these cards in front of you, and I like to call them my participation cards. And what I'd like you to do in a moment is to pair up with someone on your table and just share what you do to find, in terms of finding A players. How do you hire them and how do you retain them once they're on? And I want you to think particularly of your management team, because those are the guys that are going to make a big difference to your, potentially make a big difference to your succession plan in the long term. So where do you find these A players and what do you do to retain them other than paying them more money? What strategies do you use? So let's take about a minute or so to do this. So just a very quick share. Off you go. Sorry to stop you. I can see you're just getting going. Some great conversations happening. But I've got a lot of ground to cover in a short period of time. So I hope you found that useful. If you get a chance, just write a couple of key words down on that card, because it helps with retention later on. And if you can remember this information, you're much more likely to actually implement it for your own business. So, okay, you've got a team of A players on board. What about your plan in terms of your succession plan? I actually think there's two plans you need. One is what I would call a contingency plan. It's like a disaster recovery plan for your business. And this is to cover the disaster scenario where you as the owner or CEO of the business are killed or temporarily incapacitated. And I remember being when I was about 30 years old, I was at a conference in London that was about this subject, a family business conference, and the professor was talking about having a contingency plan. And one of the guys there kept saying, well, if I die, and then he'd say something else. And he said this 2 or 3 times. He was like, well, if I die, finally the professor couldn't take it any longer. He said, can I just stop you there? Because unless you know something that we don't, you're definitely going to die. We just don't know when that's going to be, and that's the whole point of this exercise. And I've always remembered that. And, you know, the worst thing when my father got sick and needed a major operation at short notice was there was absolutely no plan. And so it was mass confusion, basically. And so we were losing money, which didn't help. But when I joined the family business, no one really knew what was going on. There were all kinds of rumor and speculation as what was going to happen. And then in came the prodigal son, a 28-year-old, to run the business. So it wasn't a great situation. And so I would encourage you all to have even a basic plan of what happens if there's some sort of accident or catastrophe, or there's a problem. I mean, statistically, you're far more likely to be temporarily incapacitated, which might mean you're out of the business for 6 months. What happens in that scenario? Who takes over? Do you have key man insurance to cover that eventuality so that you have the cash to bring in an interim executive, someone like Frank, that can help keep things going and buy some time? And a great example of this is I have a client that it was a company that was run by 2 brothers, quite a large company, and each brother ran a division of this company. And tragically, one of them was killed in a car crash. And at that point, the surviving brother was telling me, I cannot tell you how beneficial it was that we'd actually thought through this scenario, because it was such an emotional time, as you can imagine. But we had press releases, we had information to release to our employees, we had communications to go to the bank and to our suppliers. So there's a lot of stakeholders here that just needed calming down, because one of the founders and one of the senior, a joint CEO of this company had just been killed. And he said, looking back, it was just so beneficial that we actually had that in place, that we'd thought through this scenario when we were calm and not emotional, in an emotional state. It's kind of like doing a will. No one really wants to do it, but you feel better once you've got it in place. So that's your contingency plan. And then there's your long-term succession plan, which could be, if you're a family business, identifying if there's a family member who could take the business on, making sure they've got the relevant education and training, and then mentoring them and working with them. If you're a privately held business, it could be, do you have the right person on board already to take on the business? What are you doing to prepare them? And that could be as simple as just attending meetings with you or sharing some information in the beginning, so that their knowledge of the business grows. And it might be that you don't have that person on board. You need to go and find them. And finally, you might be considering an exit, and we'll talk about potential exits in a little bit. So what's your plan? And then it's a gradual process. I think people underestimate the time it takes for a well thought out, well executed succession plan. The average length of time for a succession plan, if you're going to do it properly, is 5 to 10 years. And I didn't have that luxury. I came in the disaster scenario with my father, and within 2 years I was running the business. I would love to have had longer, and I would love there to be a gradual handover. And it's certainly not a straightforward process, because if I think of my own example, I'd been running the business for about 6 months, just trying to get to grips with things. I just hired, on the point of hiring Frank, actually. And I remember I came back one day from a meeting with Ford Motor Company, came back to the dealership, and I looked out, and there were about 150 cars missing from our lot that should have been there. And we were about to start a huge sale that weekend, so we were on TV, radio, press, the whole thing. I phoned my sales manager, and I said, what is going on? Why is there a huge hole? Why are those cars missing? He said, oh, I'm sorry, I thought you knew, Richard. Your dad came in this afternoon, and he said the site was looking a bit crowded and asked us if we could move those cars to other sites. So basically, he'd unretired, but just forgot to mention it to me. And so I phoned my mother that evening, and I remember she was like my greatest ally normally, and I remember saying to her, I just don't get it. How could he just suddenly come in and start making operational decisions without even giving me a call? She said, no, you don't get it, because he's worked for that business for 45 years. He probably should have retired about 5 years ago for his own health, but he kept going in the hope that you might one day come into it. Part of your new role as CEO is to figure out a meaningful role for him. It's his life. He needs a purpose. His identity is so closely aligned to the business. It's who he is. And then I thought about it, and I'm like, she's right. All his friends were dealers. He's been all around the world, but those were typically on manufacturer trips. And, everything he's done has been through the business. And suddenly he's left. There's no connection at all. And I'm so busy, I haven't really given that enough thought. And so what we ended up doing was once a week I would meet my father. He kept an office at the dealership, shared my assistant Jean for when he came in, which wasn't that frequent. But when he came in, I'd have a report that was like an executive summary of what was happening in the business, and then the financials. We'd look at that, we'd have a chat for a while, and then we'd go out for lunch. And it ended up being a huge thing for me, because not only was it nice to spend some time with him at the office, but also I was able to pick his brains on some complicated issues that I was having with the manufacturers. That ended up being a massive bonus, but a meaningful role for the former leader or owner is a massive thing, particularly in a family business. But a gradual process is by far the best way to have a succession, so that you have the successor gradually ramping up over time, getting more responsibility and more experience, and the incumbent CEO gradually reducing their responsibility and spending more time mentoring and developing the successor. So let's talk about advisors. I say A-player advisors. I think A-player advisors are proactive. They're not waiting for the phone to ring for you to ask for something. They're thinking ahead. And I think the fact that we're here today at an event put on by Texas Capital Bank makes them an A-player advisor, because they're looking ahead on your behalf and anticipating your needs, which is great. But I think of my CPA, Carl, when I think about an A-player advisor. He's certainly proactive. He asks questions like, well, what's your plan? What do you want to achieve? What time scale are we looking at? And then he comes back with suggestions, and we work together to come up with a detailed plan. And with Carl's help, I've managed to sell the car and truck business, managed to buy out some minority family shareholders, which, hey, any of you who've negotiated with your family, is super fun. That was about a 10-year process, by the way. But I couldn't have done it without Carl's help, his experience, and his cool head. And then when we started our commercial real estate business, he was integral. So when I think about Carl and his firm, I don't think about cost or fees or what his hourly rate is. I think about value. What's his value? What value is he helping me generate in my business? Because if you've got the right people around you, that can be absolutely huge. So A-player advisors. And the other thing to say about this in terms of succession planning is you're not going to be able to do it by yourself. You can start the process by yourself, but at some point, you're going to need help. You're going to need your CPA, your lawyer, you're going to need your bank, and you're definitely going to need a financial advisor to make sure that you are well prepared. And I'm not just, it's for you, for your family, for your employees. There's a lot of stakeholders when it comes to succession planning. So I've got the card. There's another question, and I think we're just going to take a very quick interaction here as well. What specifically are you looking for when hiring trusted advisors? And I want you to think about who you're already working with. Are they proactive? Are they the sort of people that will work with you to help you put together a plan that is going to work for the long term? So again, we'll just take a minute or so, but what are you looking for specifically with trusted advisors? Off you go. So I've got a few stats just to share with you very quickly. There's probably a few finance people in the room. Don't want to disappoint them by not having any figures at all. And this is for family-owned businesses in the United States. But it's from some research done by PricewaterhouseCoopers, but it's pretty well known in family business. But I think it just illustrates how hard succession is to pull off. And 70% of US family businesses would like to transfer to the second generation, but only 30% manage that. When you look at second generation to third generation, it's 12%. Third to fourth generation, it's only 3%. When you get to fifth generation, it's less than 1%. So it's challenging, and I think most business owners recognize that it's important. Unfortunately, succession planning is not necessarily urgent, so it doesn't make it on the to-do list. And hopefully when you leave here today, one of the things that you'll take on board is that a plan that's going to be well executed takes time. It takes time. You need people to work with to make sure it's a robust plan. And the sooner you start, the better. One of the reasons that a lot of businesses struggle with succession planning is they don't plan far enough ahead. But what's your goal? I think one of the most important things is that you're clear on that. Before you have discussions with advisors or anyone else, you should have a pretty good idea what you want to do. And there's some excellent materials that have been prepared by Texas Capital Bank. And this is just a sort of summary of that, which is, are you going to sell to a partner or your management team? If you're a family business, are you going to try identify who in the family could take the business on and pass it down to the next generation? Are you going to sell to an investor, such as private equity? Or are you going to sell to a strategic buyer, an industry buyer, which is what I did. I did a trade sale to another dealer group, and we effectively sold the car and truck dealership, and then overnight became a commercial real estate business. And that's, whichever one you choose, the planning ahead and the advisors are key, because Frank used to say to me, if I was moaning about how much money we were spending as part of the sales process, he's like, Richard, good advice is expensive, but bad advice is really expensive. And I've always kind of tried to remember that. So what's your one thing? When you leave here today, I'm not going to ask you to partner up again, but you'll see on the card, what's the one thing that you can do to actually move your succession planning forwards? How many of you actually have a succession plan in place now? Okay, a few of you. So what's the one thing you can do, either to start your plan or to revisit the plan you've already got? And it could be as simple as just putting some time aside so that you can think about it and start coming up with a rough draft. It might be that you want to discuss it with your business partner or have a meeting to discuss it with your family. Whatever it is baby steps. The main thing is to actually get started. That it's like any plan. One of my favorite things when I'm out and about and I meet business owners and I say, have you got a succession plan? Oh, yeah, I got a plan. It's all up here. All up here. I say, well, that's great. Time to get it all down here. Because if anything happens to you, unless post-mortems have come a long way, that plan is gone. A plan is not a plan unless you can share it and it's in writing and it's actually possible that it can be implemented. So I have a few minutes for questions, if anyone's got any questions. And then I have a short closing story. Yes?
These people who are in family businesses think they can solve every problem, and they get their chest out. So one, who talked you into hiring Frank, or that you needed somebody? And two, when you deal with some of your clients whose son or daughter thinks they are invincible, how do you try to get them to hire some help?
Are you in a family business, by any chance?
I'm an advisor.
Okay. But it's complicated. I think that one of the hardest things about this topic is a lot of emotion around it, because if you want to raise it, whether you're in a family business or a privately held business, if you think it's time that I almost called this talk, whose turn is it to tell grandpa he doesn't work here anymore? Because it's that kind of scenario. Who's going to ask the question? Who's going to be the brave one? Because it's kind of almost a bit taboo, particularly in some family businesses. And in some ways, I don't really know what would have happened if my father hadn't got sick, first of all, whether I'd have been the one struggling to say, Dad, isn't it about time? And the other thing, your comment about Frank, I think it was painfully obvious to most people, including myself, that I wasn't up for running such a large company. I had a business degree and a couple of years of work experience with Ford Motor Company. That does not qualify you to run a business of that size. And so I knew that I was out of my depth, and I knew I needed help. And so I was lucky that I did actually have some good advisors as well who said, let's find someone that can work with you on this, someone who's a bit more seasoned. And although I hired Frank and paid his salary and paid him a lot of money, actually, I don't regret a penny of it. I'd like a bit of a rebate on all the coffee he drank, but did that answer the question? Yeah.
Did you have siblings in the business or other family members? You alluded to it. How did you deal with that?
I was the only one actually working in the business, but I had 16 other shareholders, and we were all related, so it's good times. I remember Frank said to me early on, Richard, we got to get the shareholders on board, because part of the problem was they were taking too much out of the business. They were all driving new cars and no one was paying for any service, and they were all getting dividends, and in the meantime the business was suffering. And so we had a meeting, and we managed to get all 16 of them there, which was quite an achievement, because some of them lived in Canada, some lived in the Channel Islands, and the rest were all over the UK. And so we got them all in one room. We had a room a bit smaller than this, but a big U-shaped table, and I was at the front. Frank was sat off to the side drinking coffee, as he did. And I remember giving them the good news, which was that we're not going to have any more staff discounts or whatever. They're going to get staff discounts, but they have to actually pay for stuff now. They keep the car they've got, no more new cars after this. And then I gave them the really good news, which was, by the way, that check you get just before Christmas, the dividend or distribution, none of that either for the short term, because we're out of cash. We're out of cash. At this point, the whole room went crazy, and I was thinking, well, this is going well. So I looked over at Frank. I'm the youngest person in the room. I look over at Frank. I said, Frank, anything to say? Which was code for help. He finished his coffee, he put it down, he strolled up, slowly rubbing his chin. He said, "Aye, this reminds me of a cannibal eating his own arm. It's quite tasty, but it's got no long-term future." At which point, half the room started laughing, and the other half were like, "What? Who's this?" And then I introduced Frank and said, "Oh, this is Frank. He's going to be running the business with me." You could see them thinking, we're finished. We're completely finished. But I've gone off on a bit of a tangent. Remind me of the original question.
About the family members, and I guess you ended up having.
Yeah, so then we actually, I bought some of them out during the turnaround. We got back into profit within a couple of years, and we started playing some modest distributions again. But some of them were older, and so I was able to say, look, we can go on paying distributions, but actually, for me, if I buy you out, that's more than you're going to get in your lifetime. And so they were fairly easy. Some of the other ones took time, and I think we had 7 family shareholders other than my wife and I and our children who came into the property company for the first few years. They've subsequently sold their shares as well. But it was kind of a long-term strategy, and having Carl as my advisor was brilliant because he did a valuation of the business and then said, here, take that to any advisor you want, and we'll pay. This was his idea, and we'll pay for the advice and get them to critique it. And that was great, really, because they thought it was worth that. I was saying it was worth that, and we ended up meeting somewhere in between. One of the things that I just wanted to share is, although my son and daughter are only 18 and 21, we're already working on plans for them. My son actually wants to be a history teacher, and I don't want to stop him pursuing that. We need good teachers. But he is next year doing an internship with a property company in the UK. And so we're just making sure that he has a relevant training and work experience so that in the future, even if he's not running the business, he can still be an owner and have the experience so he understands the business. I think that's hugely important. And if I had my time again, the one thing I would like more than anything is to have more time working away from the business, working for other people, because the time I had with Ford and with those dealers was massive, very helpful. I'd just like to finish with a very quick story about my great-grandfather. His name was James Bryan, but he was known as the Governor. He was pretty tough. And he's an amazing man. I mean, he single-handedly went from being a taxi driver to the owner of one of the largest independently owned dealerships in the UK. And he did that while dealing with not one but 2 world wars and some pretty tough economic times in the late 20s and early 30s. So he had a lot of adversity to overcome. But he just persevered. And, I got to know him pretty well because he lived with us for the last 12 years of his life. So that's how I know that this is a picture of him in a good mood. But he said to me once, Richard, it's not that business owners don't have dreams. Typically, they just don't dream big enough. And so if you don't dream big enough, you can't possibly be expected to reach your full potential. And I've always remembered that. And I hope that when you leave here today and you're looking at the plans for the future of your business, is that you won't just dream, but you'll make sure that you dream big enough. Thank you very much.